city of Lexington is imagining a new Circle Road, one that makes the city more accessible than it is now.
It is not a short project by any means, but it could bring more housing and safety improvements. WKYT's Grayson Passmore sat down with the city's Planning Commission to talk more about the road's possible future.
Imagine New Circle Road with more crosswalks or bike paths. Imagine it with more small businesses along the corridor. Now, even imagine there's more places for people to live, specifically from Newtown Pike all the way to Richmond Road along North New Circle. That's exactly what Jim Duncan with Lexington's Planning Commission has done.
Provide opportunities for people who live there to have a better quality of life. And so that would result in perhaps reinvestment in some of these areas that are underperforming, that could do more, particularly large parking lots or maybe even some undeveloped spaces altogether.
Now, imagine New Circle Road isn't a development plan. It's actually a guide. The Planning Commission says they hope that they can show developers and even the city just how much land in this area is being underutilized, especially in terms of housing development.
Most of the businesses along the corridor turn their backs to the residents who are immediately behind them. So there's not really a good, strong connection of the people who live there and then the businesses that are along the corridor.
While there's plenty of room to invest in housing and new businesses, Duncan says there's even more opportunity to make the corridor safer.
We want to look at making better sidewalk and trail improvements and certainly better crossings at intersections that can be safer. And we've got a variety of recommendations throughout the plan depending on which intersection it is.
The hope is to improve the corridor over the next 20 years. In Lexington, Grayson Passmore, WKYT.
Well, the Planning Commission voted to adopt this guide. It is more than 100 pages of different recommendations or scenarios for investors and developers.
And